It's a popular opinion that Formula One would benefit from having more teams on the grid. So when news broke that Michael Andretti had gathered the necessary funding to bring a new team to the F1 grid in 2024, many fans rightly got quite excited. But the FIA has subsequently declared that they are not open to new teams joining the sport. So is Formula One closed to new teams? Let's have a look. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. The need for more teams. One of the biggest challenges that Formula One is facing right now is the fact that there are a number of drivers that have failed to get spots on the F1 grid despite showing some promising achievements in the junior categories. So, a good solution to this problem would be to have more Formula One seats, which would give drivers more opportunities to get onto the grid. The F1 grid has had 10 teams since 2017, after Manor went into administration in the previous off-season. But the regulations set a limit on the number of cars that can start each race, which is currently at 26 cars. So that equates to 13 teams, which is way over what the current grid has. It's worth mentioning here that there could be more than 13 teams, but there would always be a maximum of 26 cars that could start a race, so there would be drivers and cars that would fail to qualify. So there's definitely scope within the rules to allow new entrants onto the F1 grid, and it would probably be good for the sport by allowing more drivers to compete. It also has the potential to create more competition and appeal in the sport, especially if those teams come from new markets for Formula One. Some of the teams that have been rumoured to be thinking about joining the sport in recent times include the likes of Panthera Team Asia, potentially a new team from the Volkswagen Group, which could be Audi or Porsche, and then also the Monaco F1 team. But most recently, Michael Andretti has announced that he's applied to join the grid for the 2024 season. Now, of course, there are always teams rumoured to be joining the grid, and for the most part, these are speculative, and never really get the required backing to make a realistic bid to join. However, Andretti's father has announced that he has the required capital funding and is ready to join. But the FIA is sending some mixed messages. But before we take a look at those mixed messages, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. I have lots more content to come through the off-season as we build up to this new era of Formula One. How Formula One is sending mixed messages. Formula One has introduced new regulations to make joining the F1 grid a more appealing concept. There is a budget restriction, which means the financial requirement is not huge if a new team wants to catch up with the others on the grid. And there are also rules in terms of aero testing time limits, where the teams that are lower in the championship standings can put more time into their testing each week. Likewise, there are rules on engine supplies, where if a team is unable to secure an engine, the power unit provider with the fewest number of customer teams is required to make an offer to do so. So there are a number of factors that suggest that Formula One and the FIA both want to increase the appeal of joining the sport. However, at the same time, there are also regulations in place set by the Concord Agreement, which is something that all the teams sign up to. The most recent version of this agreement, signed in 2020, came into force in 2021, and it included elements like the cost cap and a redistribution of prize money and a new team entrant fee. The agreement is basically a way for all the teams to come together to commit to the sport for the next few years, and it's a way for teams to try and address any imbalances that they might have issues with. And this is where there are two elements of these rules that definitely act as a deterrent for a new team entrant coming into the sport. The first of these rules is the fact that a new team joining the sport would be required to pay $200 million to even get a seat at the table. And this isn't their entry fee. This is a payment that would be made and equally split amongst the current 10 teams. So even to get to the F1 grid, the new team would already have to be willing to pay their rivals a fee. This may seem a bit ridiculous, but there is some logic to it. For example, this fee shows that a team is willing and able to fund their team adequately, meaning it would be less likely for Formula One to have underfunded and underperforming teams. It would also give this team some longevity. Making a large investment means they are more likely to stick around for the long haul. The fee inherently places a large valuation on all teams on the grid, so should a team go bankrupt, it's far more likely that a buyer could be found, given they wouldn't be required to fund their way to the table. And finally, any team that pays the new entrant fee is therefore eligible for prize money in their first season, something that historically hasn't been the case. Haas, for example, didn't receive any prize money after their 8th place Constructors' Championship finish in 2016. The second of these rules that deter the new teams, though, is related to this final point, and that is the fact that the prize money structure is only set up for 10 teams. This means that should a new team join the sport, the team that finishes 11th in the standings receives nothing. Ross Brawn has described this structure as certain death for the 11th team. And I suppose this is one of the reasons for the 200 million entry fee in the first place, but certainly these two rules make joining the F1 grid far less appealing than it may have seemed previously. So the rulebook has this mixed messaging, and it was reportedly even worse for the proposed Andretti Global team. The race was told by an FIA representative that the organisation is not in a position to consider or comment on any expressions of interest or applications received. This is a pretty worrying statement. Mario Andretti, in his tweet announcing his son's intentions, claimed that he has the resources and checks every box, which suggests that he is willing and able to pay the 200 million new entry fee as well as any other FIA requirements, and is not expecting or asking for special circumstances to adjust or remove any of these rules. So if the FIA is disregarding or not even considering this application, you have to ask the question of what would be required to get a new team onto the grid, and then also why Formula 1 would not want to have more competitors. Will an 11th team ever be allowed in? When Mario Andretti tweeted about his son's ambition to enter a new team onto the F1 grid for 2024, there was a huge amount of support. Last year, there were rumours going around which suggested that the Andretti team could buy the Alfa Romeo outfit, something which fell apart after the majority shareholder in the team opted not to sell. This would have been the cheapest option to get onto the F1 grid, buying out an existing team and not having to pay that £200 million new entrant fee. It seems like Michael Andretti's ambitions remain to bring a new team to the grid, with the talks of a 2024 target entry being rumoured and potentially in the future an F2 and F3 team which would allow them to bring the most talented American drivers into Formula 1's standard junior pathway. If they pull this off, it could become an amazing opportunity for the sport as Formula 1 gains popularity in the USA and potentially more US races onto the calendar. It seems logical that having a US driver on the grid would increase this appeal further. However, there seems to be this reluctance from the FIA and potentially Formula 1 when it comes to opening the door for new teams. There have been several lessons learned when it comes to inviting new teams into the sport. The three new teams that entered in 2010, Lotus, Hispania and Virgin, all exited the sport within 6 years. They entered on the premise that the new regulations would reduce the cost of running a Formula 1 team, but between them, in their various guises, they scored a total of 3 points, and all 3 of those came from the Virgin team when they eventually became Marussia and Mana. It was a big disappointment for the sport, and their inclusion in the sport offered very little value, and in fact, perhaps even reduced the value of the other teams. This is one of the reasons for the $200 million new entrant fee. When it comes to more recent entries, with the new regulations set by the FIA being introduced for this season, more teams have shown an interest in joining the sport. But for the most part up to now, this has been disregarded, at least until these new regulations. And subsequently, the pandemic has also resulted in a relatively cautious approach when it comes to new teams. The organisers want to ensure the current competitors can succeed and be financially sustainable before they go on to allow other teams in. It's a tentative approach, and one that's probably sensible in the long run. But for me, when you have such a huge motorsport name like Andretti, you have to think about how good it could be for the sport. And if what they say is true, which is that they have the financial backing required to pay the relevant fees to get into the sport, personally, I think it needs to be taken seriously as it could be massively beneficial. If you want to learn more about this new entrant fee and why it's so important in this new cost-capped era, make sure you watch this video next.